Asiam Nasiaya, Ain't Pek Velocilton, Anis Nanemo, Ait Mishwallowan Quanas EFE, Heit Sevka, Musquia Mastimo, Heit Sevka Sia Mastimo. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. My name is Doug White. Thank you very much, the Dean, for the introduction. My Coast Salish name is Velocilton. My Nuu-chah-nulth name is Cleishan. I want to begin by thanking my uncle, Elder Larry Grant, very much for the words that he shared this morning. I think he got us started off in such a good and strong way, in a way that shows recognition and respect of the Musqueam peoples that were gathered up in their territory. There's a number of things I want to talk about today in the next 45 minutes or so. I want to share some recent developments in Canadian law about Aboriginal title, in particular the Chilcotin decision, but I want to tell some stories and share some experiences of Indigenous peoples here in this part of the world and planning. As a background to a discussion about Aboriginal title and how it's what the court said this past summer and what it means for all of us in this country and what it means for you in this field. So I want to say that at the outset, there's been a very long history here in this part of the world in terms of trying to sort out the Crown First Nations relationship. The very first instance of the relationship over on Vancouver Island, where I'm from the Snuneymuxw, on the other side of the water. And for a period of years in the early ages of the colonial government, there was a basic, uncontroversial recognition that the existing rights, the relationship of Indigenous peoples to their territories, needs to be respected. There were some treaties that were entered into, 14 treaties on Vancouver Island from 1850 to 54 that are premised on a basic idea of recognition and respect, and that we need to find a way to live together. The treaties themselves, there's the text of the treaties that's down in the BC archives. It's a very interesting story in history there. Douglas negotiated treaties with the Indigenous peoples around Victoria. And then when he was finishing his negotiations, he wrote to London and said, I've done my negotiations with the Aboriginal peoples. Now I need a text for the treaties. Can you please send me something? And in a roundabout way, agreements made in New Zealand called the Kempstead between the Maori and the New Zealand Company in that context made their way to London. And from London, the New Zealand Company's office to the Hudson's Bay Company's office. And 6 months later, made their way to Vancouver Island, where they had formed the text of the Douglas Treaty. Important to know that the treaties, in the words of them, talk about extinguishment of title. That's absolutely inconsistent with the oral history of the Indigenous peoples of Vancouver Island. And that remains a contested issue. The basic premise and idea being in the text that for some reason my ancestors 160 years ago, for a stack of blankets, agreed to walk away from who they are and from their territory. Nonsense. So we know that's not a correct conception of a relationship from the past. What was talked about in terms of the oral history, I think reflects much more. It's important for how we need to interact, the way that we need to think about the future at this point because of the Chilcotin decision this summer. First, a very important principle of recognition of territory, of village sites and enclosed fields, and of the resources that the Indigenous peoples depend upon for their way of life. And very clear recognition in letters shared by Douglas with others at the time that there was a principle of non-interference at play. I have made clear to the Indigenous peoples of this land that we will not be interfering with their way of life in any way, and that their relationship with fisheries, for example, will carry on as formerly, as when they were the only people in this part of the world. So interesting history there. But in 1854, December 23rd, 160 years ago, this past December, there was an important shift away from that model of recognition and respect and engagement. This idea that Aboriginal title doesn't really matter. You know what, it's too expensive, it's too complicated. Raises real political troubles. we start to talk about Aboriginal title with Indigenous peoples, it gets to, I think one of the phrases was, troublesome excitements arise. I think we need to shift into something, a different mode. Maybe we can do this in terms of the development of Vancouver Island and British Columbia without addressing Aboriginal title. Aren't they all going to die off anyways? I mean, aren't they going to be assimilated into our culture anyways? Let's just shift into a mode where we ignore and deny the reality of the legal rights of the Indigenous peoples of this part of the world. That was a fundamental decision in the history of this country, of this province, that we continue to grapple with today. It was deepened in its approach, and it became the official narrative of this province. The policy of denial took firm root. Instead of a recognition in the treaty that my people should maintain the places that they live in and that they depend upon, very shortly after 1854, my people were being dispossessed of those spaces and pushed away from the spaces that the Crown had just in 1854 acknowledged as being theirs. I say and I argue that that's the first recognition of what's called Aboriginal title in this country. It was in the Douglas Treaties on Vancouver Island. But we were pushed by 1864. It's the first record of advocacy that I'm aware of my people. Standing up to say, they went and saw Governor Kennedy at the time down in Victoria and said, we've got a real problem with how things are unfolding here. We ask you, we implore you to live up to the agreement our peoples just entered into only 10 years ago. We were pushed out of those village sites, the real home of the Snuneymuxw, the main winter village sites at Departure Bay and downtown Nanaimo, to the very extremely tiny reserves that we have today. At the same time, the entire Coast Salish world in that same time period was split in half by the Oregon Treaty, the Treaty of Washington from 1846. Got resolved in terms of the Oregon Territory in Western North America. This territory that the British and the Americans agreed that somehow this is British and American sovereignty, we will sort it out at some point, but for now, as against the rest of the world, the Oregon Territory is somehow within our control and our domain. And then by 1846, they came to the agreement and the understanding between themselves about how this part of the world would be divided between them. And they extended the 49th parallel across to the ocean, and they said that Vancouver Island would go to the British. There's been some debate about, there was some little fights about some of the Gulf Islands in the Salish Sea. But what that meant for my people was that our world was split in half in an important way. That relations on the American side of the border were now in an entirely different context than us. And that's a reality of the Coast Salish peoples that continues to play out today. You know, we talked, an important theme of this day's conference and discussion is about decolonization, deconstructing the planning, the planning status quo. And so this has always been the case for a very long period of time. And what I'm going to be talking about is how the Chilcotin decision actually prompts us to return to those first principles that I'll talk about in a bit. I want to share a couple of quick stories about my own people and about planning. So after we've been pushed out of our main village sites, the places that we consider to be home, including over here on the Fraser River where my people had a summer fishing village, we lived on these tiny little reserves. I grew up on a 40-acre reserve and surrounded by the city of Nanaimo. And one of the first examples that I'm aware of real sort of outsiders planning and imagining our communities is expressed in a book called Among the Onkaminums, referring to the Hulkaminum speaking peoples. A fellow named Thomas Crosby, Methodist missionary at the time in the mid-19th century that lived and worked with my people. In his book, this Among the Onkaminums is primarily about the Snuneymuxw people. And I think it's chapter 4 or 5 that is really, for me, what I want to share with you and talk about and think about. It's called, the title is called, of this chapter is called Heathen Street versus Christian Street. And what he's talking about is something that's important to, it's not so much the religion that I really want to talk about, that aspect of it. I want to talk about the architecture related to what he shared, the way that he re-envisioned the community space of that Indian reserve. Because what Heathen Street was it's actually called now Shoreline Drive, the road that I grew up on as a kid. It's called Heathen Street by him. What he meant by that was that this is a road down on the water on the beach, where there's a series of longhouses, big, huge structures. What in God's name are these people doing? That's not a proper way. Living. Look, multiple families living in one house, multiple generations, all in one home. That's no way to live. And as people converted to Christianity, they were allowed to move up to Christian Street, which is now Center Street. And there they were, the structures that were built on Christian Street were nuclear family homes. This is what a proper home looks like. This is the way that people are meant to live their lives. A husband, a wife, and their children. This physical structure here is the proper way to live for you now. That's, when I read that, I was stunned by that fact. The impact of architectural conceptions of what's a proper way to live, what's a proper way to house yourselves. In some ways, that difference, that architectural imposition of how to live lives has had a very profound impact, equal to many of the other kinds of things that we're all aware of in terms of the impulses of colonization in this country, all the different strategies, all the different ways that was done. It's important to keep in mind that the very way that we build homes has an impact on the way that we think about ourselves and who we are, and what is our proper relationship to our auntie, to our niece or our nephew, to our grandparents. How are we meant to look after them? How are they meant to be in our lives? It was fundamentally changed by Thomas Crosby's conception of what he called Heathen Street and Christian Street. I want to say too now, this little 40-acre reserve that I grew up on is, there's an important thing. The Nanaimo is a beautiful part of the world. Holy smokes, it's beautiful. Beautiful coastal city. Beautiful rivers. Beautiful ocean. Beautiful forests. Over the course of the last 160 years since the development of the city, we're the Snuneymuxw have one of the longest histories of relations of an urban context. The urban context with the First Nations context in British Columbia, in this part of the world, one of the longest histories is at my home, the Snuneymuxw. You think about 160 years of decision making about spaces, about places, about land use. And you think about who was in control of those decisions. Who are the people that were making those decisions? Who are the people that took it upon themselves to structure the new development of that part of the world? And we talk about this concept we constantly hear about in the paper, about land use decisions, this NIMBY principle, not in my backyard. Well, I just wanted to share with you that the other person's backyard is actually most of the reserves. Certainly in Snuneymuxw and in almost every other community in British Columbia where there's an Indian Reserve municipal interface, more often than not, the not in my backyard projects land adjacent to reserves. So my little 40-acre reserve, on the north end of it, it's got multiple different kinds of mills. On the western edge of it, it's got recycling plants. The southern end, more mills. Through the middle of it, this tiny little reserve. Cut through the middle of it is a train track. In front of it is a log booming ground. Our other little reserve up on the river, adjacent to it, is the regional landfill, the dump. All the people of the city bring their trash and dump it next to my reserve. It's 2000, we're deep into the 21st century. When I was chief for 4 years, one of my critical bits of work at home at Snuneymuxw was to connect that Indian Reserve number 2 adjacent to the regional landfill to the city water supply. A water main of which had been going within a few feet of that reserve for decades. And I showed up and one of the first things I saw in terms of the finances of the nation was this amazing amount of money being given to this water company. And I said, someone better tell me what this is all about. What in God's name is this money for? And I said, oh, well, the wells have been shut down for 25, 30 years on IR number 2 because of contamination. So we had to build cisterns and we buy water and we get water shipped here. Like, are you kidding me? What are you talking about? There's city water at the end. You stand in the reserve and this is where the water main is, the pipe. It's been there for decades. So my work, I think about the work of my grandparents' generation and what they did, getting electricity hooked up. Still, the most fundamental basic things. And this is, I'm not talking about northern Manitoba here or northern Ontario, hundreds of miles from infrastructure. I'm talking about a community surrounded for 160 years by an urban context. And that somehow we have lived our lives in patterns of isolation and silos from each other. That's a central challenge. I want to talk a little bit too, one other story I want to share. When I became chief, one of the first things, we have so little land. I'll share 2 quick stories. And I was asked to go and give a talk at the local university and a Chamber of Commerce function about the regional economy. So I went and talked, and they said they wanted my view about the importance of the regional economy and how Snuneymuxw was related to that. So I talked about what is the single most important challenge and obstacle for the Snuneymuxw people to be engaged in the regional economy, the local economy. I said, it's land. We're one of the biggest First Nations in the province by population. We have one of the smallest reserves. It has fundamentally impoverished us, that we think about what lands and spaces are meant to do and provide for peoples. Obviously, the first one is somewhere to live, somewhere to go and pray, somewhere to have natural resources in that you can sustain yourselves from, public spaces. Think of all the different categories of what land does for peoples. This horrendous little impoverished little Indian reserve, 40 acres, doesn't even fulfill the very first one. Earlier today, at one of the segments, we were talking about the massive urban Aboriginal populations in cities. Well, there's a lot of Snuneymuxw in Vancouver, a lot of Snuneymuxw in town in Nanaimo, in Seattle. Those are the 3 biggest regions, Seattle, Vancouver, and the Nanaimo is where our people live. Why do they live there? Partly because they were, working, living with their families in the United States side of the Coast Salish world, chasing work, picking hops, picking berries, and settle down. But most importantly, because they don't have an option to live in their community. They don't have the space to live on the reserve. So I went and gave a talk about land being the central challenge of myself in terms of being the leader of the Snuneymuxw and every leader that's ever worked in the last century and longer of the Snuneymuxw people in terms of trying to break these patterns of poverty. We need more land. We must find ways to deal with a simple basic need of land and space. 45-minute keynote like this, I gave a talk. I walked out of the room and they had like a sort of a little, I don't know if it's called a charrette or what it is, when people go and talk, they go from table to table, different topics. One of them was the Port Authority that was talking about the redevelopment of downtown Nanaimo. There's an important piece of land there. Someone said in that conversation, we're thinking about this. It's such a beautiful waterfront land. It's all this industrial uses of the Port Authority. We need to find ways to repurpose and to change what had been industrial uses to something that can be more beneficial and can drive a more progressive city. Someone said, that little 40-acre reserve that the Indians have, they haven't used it very well. I wonder if we could get that off of them and do something proper with it. So, I'm sharing this story to share what part of the challenge is in real decolonization and deconstructing the realities that have been built up over 160 years. Because the chief of Snuneymuxw had just walked out of the room talking about this horrible history of dispossession and being put onto tiny little reserves, and someone in that room was willing to utter that phrase. Maybe we should get that last little bit of land off of them. They certainly don't use it very well. Somebody said that. Someone then wrote it down in the minutes, and then someone emailed it to the chief. Holy moly, man. I've told that story time and time again with my own counsel, with my own people. Everybody needs to know the challenges and the obstacles that we face in our work, because that's something else. Holy man, what a story. Now, in terms of the part of my work when I showed up was to bring in a world-famous architect to help me work through the potential of the existing reserve lands, and then a couple of other pieces of lands that are potentially acquired over the coming years. 1,000 acres of Gabriola Island, that big, beautiful island where we only have a 1-acre reserve left. 1 acre. Well, maybe it's almost 2. I think it's 1.6 or 7. So 2 acres on Gabriola. But there's 1,000 acres of Gabriola that's held in some kind of a trust for us in relation to the failed treaty negotiations of our people from 15 years ago. Beautiful piece of land. And then there's a piece of federal land in the middle of Nanaimo, the Department of National Defense lands just to the south of Vancouver Island University. Another key piece of land that we should be able to acquire at some point. Those pieces of land, the existing reserves, I wanted this person to help us understand what the opportunities were and what the challenges were, and how can we start putting the pieces back together of our world. And the story I wanted to share with you I took him on a tour of all of those lands, and then I took him on a walking tour of the reserve that I grew up on. This is someone who has built some of the most astonishing, beautiful spaces on the face of the earth. Different countries. Brought him on just by some kind of a fluke, I have a connection to him. So he came and we spent some time together. Walked around the community of the reserve. We sat down. This is early in my term as chief, because I still had this sweet elderly lady was my band manager from the Cowichan peoples, who had come out of retirement to help the former chief who had passed away unexpectedly. And so we're sitting there talking. Let's hear from this man what he thinks about what we have to work with, where we found ourselves at in 2010. He said, I want you to know that if I lived in this community, I would kill myself. And I was like, who the hell does this person think he is, talking like this to me and my people? This poor old lady from Cowichan, crying away. It was such a shocking thing to hear from somebody. He said, this place, you want to talk about this place has no planning. This is total and complete chaos. Everything from the roads to the houses, to everything that we think about in terms of planning communities. It's just total chaos. It's a painful environment to look at and to witness, to be in. Isn't that something else? Holy man. Place I grew up in. Used to tease, sitting around, we have competitions over sad stories at different meetings. Say to Howard Grant, all I had to play in my growing up as a little kid was a ditch in front of my house. And we'd have little sticks to play with, pretend we're playing with boats and stuff when it's raining. He said, you had a ditch? Wow. There's something in what he saw that's, I think, important for everyone to be aware of. He didn't see in any way at all that anyone had put love or care or attention into the design of my community. He didn't see the things he looks for when he's thinking about how community should be. And that deeply, deeply troubled him. So now what do we do, right? What are the things that we have to work with to overcome those challenges and that reality of 160 years of living with a policy of denial, 160 years of living with other people's decisions that have had profound impacts on our way of life, and in the view of this architect, threaten our lives? Imagine that. Isn't that something? Have you ever heard anyone say anything like that before? That planning decisions threaten the lives of people. The accumulation of 160 years of decision making has turned this community into a place that threatens their very lives. Holy man, something else. Now, I want to shift now. I wanted to share those few things because I'm full of hope. It's important to have our eyes wide open to the challenge. I want to be clear that that's a community full of loving people, loving families that look after each other. It's one of the most vibrant cultural spaces that I'm aware of in Indigenous North Americas, in the Coast Salish world. Just down the street from us where we are, that world unfolds in the most beautiful ways in the Musqueam community, in their lawn houses. Likewise, the lawn houses of Snuneymuxw communities and others. Astonishing, beautiful, strong, resilient people, notwithstanding all of what I've just described, have lives that are full of beauty and are grateful to the Creator for the lives that they have, the beautiful lives that they have. So in terms of work and advocacy and trying to figure out how do we shift out of this framework that we find ourselves in, how do we overcome this context? In different periods, there's all kinds of different ways we can go about this. One of them that in the past has been the legal process in Canada. That after it was outlawed to hire someone like myself to advocate for Indigenous rights, in 1927, that law was repealed in 51. Then it became possible for the legal process to start to say something about the issues that we're gathered up here today to talk about and to consider. What the issue, the basic fundamental question, the organizing question of all provincial Aboriginal organizations of the last 100 years has been what's been called the Indian land question. It's the question that's been left to us because of Douglas's decision and others to turn away from proper relations, to dispossess us as Indigenous peoples of our relationship to our territories. It's the people, the Indigenous people, standing up in the most powerful and dignified ways well over a century of time to say, there's something wrong here. We have a relationship with our territory, with our lands that is important to us, that we believe legally means something in your legal system. And we need the courts to say something about that. We need the politicians to say something about that. And they were denied and denied and denied over well into the mid-20th century. The first instance of standing up was actually in my community in the White and Bob litigation, where there was a treaty issue at a hunting rights case where people stood up, Clifford White and David Bob, and said, we have a treaty right to do what we're doing. and they lost on trial. They were called pigs for daring to raise this counter-narrative to the official narrative. Magistrate Beaverpot said, "Clifford, it's pure piggishness on your part to be raising this alleged treaty in my courtroom." So deep was the history and the narrative of denial that a magistrate in the 1963, the summer of 63 in Nanaimo, was able to say to someone, "What kind of a lunatic are you to talk about treaties? Everybody knows there were never treaties made in British Columbia." Anyways, the arguments on appeal, we brought in Tom Berger, Maisie Hurley, this amazing character that was the editor of the Native Brotherhood, the Native Voices newspaper. The Native Voice, the Native Brotherhood's newspaper. She helped us, connected us with Tom Berger. We were connected with Frank Calder, who was an MLA at the time up in the Nisga'a, the Nass. Guy Williams from the Native Brotherhood, another important Aboriginal leader, and all the local First Nations all gathered up to help bring that appeal forward, all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada. And they argued this. They said, in the first instance, our argument depends upon you acknowledging that there's actually a treaty on Vancouver Island from 1854. If you disagree with that, then our alternative arguments are about the Aboriginal title and rights of the Indigenous peoples. So you choose, you pick what you're going to deal with. And they agreed on the treaty side, so we were successful. Amazing, all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada in the mid-60s. It's amazing what they did back then. Then later that decade, in 1969, Frank Calder and Tom Berger then brought forward the Nisga'a people's litigation for Aboriginal title. So that was the first time that the issue of Aboriginal title was fully in front of the court and fully put forward, this history, because they said we want the court to declare that Aboriginal title, our Aboriginal title, has never been extinguished. The court said that I've got to rethink how much I'm going to talk about this. We've got 5 minutes here before Q&A. The court said a number of important things. That Aboriginal title is inherent. It doesn't depend upon any Crown Act. It doesn't come from the Crown. It comes from these people and their pre-existing relationship with themselves and their territories. And that is what the Indian land question is all about. It's about Indigenous peoples reestablishing their relationship with their territories. All this other stuff of the courts, consultation, justifiable infringement, all that stuff, that's all sort of secondary. That's like a secondary issue about the relationship between Aboriginal peoples and the Crown. But importantly, the court said we're going to split on whether on an issue, and we're going to leave as a technicality. The seventh judge said, for technical reasons, I won't make a decision. And this opened up a 40-year history of the courts of refusing to make a decision about Aboriginal title. So from Calder in the 60s through to the BC Court of Appeal in Chilcotin in 2012, there was not a single court in this country over 40 years that had ever made a single legal declaration about Aboriginal title to a single grain of sand in the second largest country on the face of the earth. This issue was in front of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights in Washington, D.C. as the Organization of American States when the Hul'qumi'num peoples to the south of my people brought forward a petition to that international body and said, we want you to comment on the fact that we cannot have our Aboriginal title properly recognized in Canada. And in terms of standing in that kind of international forum, Canada showed up to defend themselves and say, we want this petition struck for the reason that these people have not exhausted their domestic remedies. The Hul'qumi'num peoples and dozens of First Nations and organizations across the country put forward briefs to that Inter-American Commission telling the story about, on the one hand, because Canada said they could either go to court or they could go and negotiate a treaty in the BC treaty process. So we all told the stories about the court never having made a decision after tens of millions of dollars in 4 decades of time. And we told the story about the BC treaty process and the mandates that the Crown showed up with, contrary to what they said at the outset of that process. the court agreed. They said clearly, the legal process in Canada has not made itself available to Indigenous peoples in a meaningful way in relation to their Aboriginal title. It's almost like there's something like a political question doctrine at play in Canada, that the very justiciability of Aboriginal title is in question because everyone refuses, do these judicial acrobatics to refuse to make a decision. And then on, they said for the treaty process, for its part, quite the opposite from recognizing title. It's about setting title aside, effectively extinguishing title. So that's no answer either. And they, in a very embarrassing decision, they refused Canada's arguments and they agreed with the Halkominum and the other Indigenous peoples of Canada. Very quickly, what Aboriginal title said in terms of this decision, why this decision was so, it's easily one of the most important decisions the Supreme Court of Canada has ever made. It's on the order of Brown and Board of Education in the United States. This is a society-shifting decision. And then, of course, everyone cries about judicial activism. But here's the reality. Those 40 years of justices refusing to make decisions, they were constantly saying to the politicians, go and do your work with Indigenous peoples. We feel uncomfortable with the thought that we should be resolving these issues. We're ill-equipped in some ways, Justice Vickers said. Go and sit down in his beautiful reconciliation statement in the trial decision in Chilcotin said, yet again, please go and sit down and talk, resolve these things. 4 decades of politicians failing to live up to that imperative, that direction, brought the Supreme Court of Canada to a major point where they had to decide, is the legal process in Canada going to continue to play any kind of a meaningful role in resolving the disputes around Aboriginal title or not? And so they rose to the challenge and they knocked down the arguments of decades of federal and provincial governments arguing against Aboriginal title. One of the key issues in the decision was about what is the scope of Aboriginal title? Is it the small spots? Because Justice Groverman, for a unanimous BC Court of Appeal, said, effectively to Aboriginal leadership, go get back on your reserves and sit down and shut up about Aboriginal title because that story's done, it's dead. Because Aboriginal title, at most, is maybe the rock you stand on when you're fishing, and that is a direct quote. Look down to your feet to see where you're standing. That's where your Aboriginal title is. Don't look up to the mountains, don't look to the valleys. Very narrow. This is in 2012. It was like reading a decision from 100 years earlier. So it really, all of that really put the court in a position. And they decided that Aboriginal title is territorial in scope, collectively held, of course, by the Aboriginal nation. That's an important thing to think about and to turn your mind to. They say that it's inalienable. They say that there's some kind of limitations related to it. In Delgamuukw, Justice Lemaire talked about, he sort of put a clumsy metaphor to, or analogy to, the doctrine of equitable waste and trust law, and said that the current generations of Aboriginal peoples are in the position of a person that has a life interest in a trust property and has an obligation to what's called the remainderment, the people next in line to have the next life interest, that they can't commit wanton equitable waste. And everyone thought, that's kind of patronizing. Isn't that kind of weird? Like, why are we still talking in these ways? Like Aboriginal peoples don't know how to look after their own territory. Just 2 things I want to finish with. Aboriginal title, when you look at the deep structures of it, it's not primarily a property interest, a private property interest. What it reflects, even though the court didn't discuss this in explicit terms, the very structure of Aboriginal title implies a governmental, state-like relationship with territory. And when I was doing some research in August and doing some writing, doing some legal opinions on the decision, I looked very closely to try and understand, is there any model that the court turned to in terms of an Aboriginal title, what it means back in '97 in Delgamuukw when it fully took shape. And it seemed clear to me, based on my research, that it's possible that the court referred to what's called the public trust doctrine, which is primarily American law these days. But what the public trust doctrine talks about the state obligations in relation to state property, that there's a public beneficial interest of that property in the public itself. And the state just can't run amok and start alienating that land to third-party interests if it doesn't in some way, if it's not connected to the public benefit and public interest. That it's something like a fiduciary relationship to the land. So that's something to think about. I won't say too much more about that issue, but it's a very interesting thing. I would implore any of you to look into the relationship of Aboriginal title and public trust, because the other major thing that this decision did in the summer is it shifted us out of the sort of weak, impoverished framework of consultation of the Haida decision from a decade ago, and effectively pushes us into a framework of consent being the organizing principle of decision-making now. In other words, Aboriginal peoples have a say about decisions. It's not a government decision that they go and talk to the Indians about and then make their decision. It's a recognition and a reality that the government has things they want to do, and Aboriginal peoples also have a decision about stating priorities and stating objectives in relation to their territories. So there's important implications there about jurisdiction and about the simple fact that there's 160 years of law and policy premised on denial that now has to fundamentally shift. That includes planning law and law related to planning. So I hope some of the things I've said gives you a moment to think, to pause, to see some of the landscape we've been in, the landscape we're in now, and where we're all going. It's certainly my impression, my work and experience is that Aboriginal peoples are willing to sit down and to sort these things out. So I hope, I want to really thank the school, the university for the opportunity to come and share a few words. Thank you.